with head nerd in charge in the Indie Comics Dispatch, coming at you today for another part of our series on representation in comic books with Jennifer from Comics Will Break Your Heart. Jennifer, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me today, Brett. I appreciate that.
No problem. So tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, your love of comic books. Give us the details.
Got it. So, as you can tell, I really enjoy comics, and I'm. It's funny. A lot of people, because they end up seeing the background behind me, and I don't know if the assumption is that I just read and trade, but I actually do read a lot in single issues as well. I was actually just having a conversation with one of my friends from high school, who I remember they told me, must have been like 15 years now. They told me back then when I was only reading graphic novels, they're like, don't ever get addicted to single issues. And here I am with like way too many long boxes. But anyways, I'm a huge reader. I think that's the biggest part of my comic book journey, is being a comic book reader. I am still a collector, but I don't collect for, oh, this one's a first appearance, or, oh, this one I can buy this one for this much and flip it for this much. That's not really my game. I'm more of a reader, and I love the stories that comic books tell.
I love that. And I do have to comment on your setup behind you, because I've always admired the walls of books you have back there. It's awesome.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I actually have a very small, like just over a 400 square foot apartment. So like this is it. This takes up the majority of that small apartment. You can't really see above me, but the bookcase, I've got like a ton of like action figures and statues and stuff above there. But I need to get a better bookshelf, because I'm afraid this one's a cheap one that I bought kind of on the fly, or 3 of them. I'm afraid it's going to fall at any moment. So.
Yeah, we don't want that.
No.
Comic books take up a lot of weight when you get that many on a shelf.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So your Instagram handle is Comic Books Will Break Your Heart. Yeah. Explain that to us.
Yeah. So originally, for a couple of years, I was operating. I make it sound a lot fancier than it is. But I was like operating under this name, Gin and Comics. And I wanted to do, like, my original kind of like thought was to do a like a show, or like basically like drunk comic book reviews. And even though like I still enjoy drinking, but I didn't really think that captured the spirit of what I wanted to do with comic book reviews. I did want them to see a little bit more professional, and not to say that, like, you can't have a drink every now and then and still not be a professional, but I didn't want to feel like anyone who was maybe living a sober lifestyle was excluded, or anything like that. So I think like a lot of people during the global pandemic crisis, when we are all like locked at home, and like I said earlier, I had been doing this for several years under Gin and Comics, and then I think it was late one night or early one morning, I was having sleeping issues, and there's always so much heartbreak going on in the comic book industry. And Jack Kirby said it the best: comics will break your heart, kid. And I think I was just thinking, like, comics like a lot of the stuff that's going on in the industry, it is breaking my heart, and it's not like that's anything new. So I feel like I was having this identity crisis with what I wanted to do. I knew, like so many others, that I wanted to do a more like official blog or something. And then it had just kind of finally clicked, and I'm like, that's it. So under most other things, I operate under Comics Will Break Your Heart, which is a truer to the Jack Kirby quote. However, Instagram, someone already took that title.
Jerks.
So yeah, I know, right? But hey, if you're out there, like, I will, if Comics Will Break Your Heart on Instagram, if you're watching this, I got you. I will pay you money to get it. Well, anyways, so on Instagram I do Comic Books Will Break Your Heart, but pretty much everywhere else I'm Comics Will Break Your Heart.
Fantastic. That's awesome. I love that. I started following you when you were Gin Comics still.
Yeah.
And I saw the transition and always wondered about the transition. That's a good point. That's a great point.
Yeah, it was literally like a late night thing where it clicked, and I'm like, okay, this sounds more of my, I don't want to make it like it's my brand or something, but I feel like it
Right.
captured the spirit of literally like I wake up and I go on Twitter and I'm like frustrated, or just something happens in the industry and I'm just not, but I still love comics. So
That's awesome. That's awesome.
yeah.
And so we are pre-recording this. It is actually in September as we're recording this.
Mhm.
But this episode will air the first Wednesday in October.
Mhm.
And so I just want to remind everybody that we've been doing this series on representation in comics, and talking about different underrepresented populations in the comic book industry. And so today we're talking with Jennifer about white women, because
Mhm.
we've had Frankie on the air at this point, that this is airing, to talk about representation of Black women. And while there's overlap in those representations, there's also a vast amount of difference too. And so
Mhm.
that's why I wanted to kind of parse that out a little bit. Same disclaimer I say in every show about representation: we're going to miss a category of people in this round, and I'm so sorry about that. And so we'll try harder next time to get more people represented, when we do this again, hopefully next year also. So that's my disclaimer. If we missed out on a population that you want to see represented on the show, tell me, call me out on it. It's cool. So, Jennifer, comics.
Yeah.
How did you become a fan of comics, superheroes, etc., etc.? What's your
Yeah.
origin story?
So I would say that my origin story, it's twofold. You know how collectors and spectators, there's always the like first appearance and then the first appearance in costume or something like that,
Right.
or the first appearance, and but then you have like the first appearance of the alias, or
Yep.
so I would say the true beginning would be when I was in middle school. And I had just read, I can't remember if it was Stardust by Neil Gaiman or Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. I'm leaning towards Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. And um, I was reading several of his books. I was a library kid. I didn't have too many friends. I was a weird kid in high school and middle school, and I'm still kind of a weird kid now. So I spent a lot more time there than I like, at lunchtime, like I went to the library and hung out instead of eating like with kids in the cafeteria. So I think that I had looked up Neil Gaiman and had read a couple other things by him. And then I ended up getting into Sandman. And so fast forward, say, a couple years after I had a high school teacher, my teacher, Mr. Vina, in high school. He was my photography teacher, and he had a ton of comics. Like he literally, like he had like a little bookcase behind his desk, and I was able to absorb so much from his collection, and that included a lot of Vertigo titles, but it was a lot of titles like The Sandman, Watchmen, Transmetropolitan, Fables. So those are the stories that I really got
Wow.
into. So I would say, like in middle school, like yes, I was reading Neil Gaiman, but then it transitioned into reading things like The Sandman, which I would say that's the one that like got me hooked on comics and graphic novels. And at that time, that's the same era whenever I had a high school friend who, because I was only reading trades at that time, because that's pretty much all I could get a hold of. There was a really small, kind of rinky dinky little comic book store in town that was operating out of a storage unit. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah, so it wasn't really a place where like a 16-year-old girl is going to go.
Right.
So, I read just the trades that I could get, at the library, and you know, however many years, almost 17 years later, here I am, and I'm addicted, and I can blame it all on Neil Gaiman.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
That's awesome. And you just got done reading like 100 graphic novels in a month, didn't you?
I did in July. So my origin story there
Uh-huh.
is that I in late May I was walking to work, and it was actually like my first day back to work after being quarantined for a couple months. Apparently a couple months in quarantine was all it would take for me to forget how to walk. I was walking so I was walking to work, and I tripped and fell, and my toe really hurt, but I wasn't going to take off my shoe in the middle of work, and it really hurt. And then anyways, I broke my toe. It was all bruised and everything, and they were like, okay, go ahead and, you'll probably be staying home. There was, and there still is, a lot of civil unrest happening. And so, and because of quarantine and because of, new waves of coronavirus cases, my workplace is actually still closed. And so anyways, in July, I did take some time, and I don't know if it was like the pain meds or I just knew that I was going to be laying in bed for a couple weeks. Powell's Books, which is the world's largest new and used bookstore, it's a whole city block wide, and they were closed, but they were doing a really good deal, and you could do pickup. So I ended up ordering probably about 50 books from them.
Wow.
And so then there was a couple things on my shelf that I hadn't read. There were a couple series that I wanted to reread. So I'm just like, screw it. Let's do 100 books and see where this goes. And some days it was really good. Like some days I read series that are my absolute favorite: Saga, East of West, Descender, Monsters, Paper Girls. I reread a lot of these titles, but then there were some titles that were like, that I thought that I loved, that after a reread, I'm like, I hate this. So some, and some days were good, and then towards the end, it really got like, okay, this is a lot. It's a lot of reading. So that was my 100 books in a month.
That's kind of how I felt. I started rereading a while back the reboot of Superman in the 80s, and I had read it at some point and loved it. And as I was rereading, I was like, this is horrible, actually. There's so much like bad going on here with John Byrne's writing.
Yeah. I don't want to trash talk one particular author because I've done it a little bit on some like other places. So I don't want to like trash talk too much, but like there's a particular writer I'm probably never gonna pick up another book by them. Sorry.
Yeah. I feel you on that. So let's comic book collecting and the comic community. A lot of fanboys out there see it as a male thing, and that if you're a woman doing it, you're a poser.
Yeah.
How have you been affected by? I call it dude broness. I don't know what other people call it. Have you been affected by this?
I would say yes and no, and I think that yes. I think that because personally, I think that because it is primarily something that I feel like people who are drawn to comic books, not always, but people who are drawn to a lot of these stories are the underdog, right? Like comic books write about the underdog. They speak to those characters, either that they're able to overcome something, overcome trauma, overcome, I don't want to say like a weakness or a disability, but they overcome something. Maybe it's a kid who is picked on, someone who is bullied. And I think that comic books, a lot of times those stories speak to it, whether it's a superhero story or not. And so I think that people who are bullied end up latching onto that. And the flip side of that coin of latching onto that means I need to protect this with everything. And that means being exclusive to who we enter in. And sometimes I think that that does come as a form of self-defense. Like it's protection in order to do that, because these stories end up meaning so much to us and they become part of our identities, right? So I think in order to protect that, in order to protect our mental space, the comics community has become a lot more exclusive, instead of let's bring more people in, right? Let's tell more people's stories, because I'm afraid if we tell more people's stories, they're going to stop telling my story. So I think that because primarily dude bros have been writing a lot of these stories, those are the stories that speak to certain people, and those are the ones that get told the most often, and those type of people latch on to it. And instead of inviting more people to the table, we exclude those people, right? And I feel like a lot of I haven't necessarily been excluded. I think that a lot of women they have to fight harder to get in. And for me, reading, I like to read a little bit outside of not only my comfort zone, but outside of the comfort zone of the stories that are typically told. And I've made a concerted effort to read those stories, to engage with those stories. And I think a lot of the gatekeepers of the industry haven't learned that yet. Yet, I'm not going to tell you what stories you have to read. I'm not going to tell you what stories you have to like. But for me, part of my comic book journey, part of my reading journey in general, means reading stories that are outside of that comfort zone and reading a diverse range of stories. So I don't necessarily, like I said, get the "you're not allowed in here," but
Right.
it's subtle, and it's, oh well, who are you buying for? Let me go ahead and I'm going to suggest a particular type of story that is maybe more geared towards women, or it's a cuter story. I mean, granted, like I remember going into a comic book store and someone was like, oh, like you're a girl, let me tell you about We Three, and because it's animals, but Grant
Right.
Morrison is like, so I think that even though that was very good natured, it does
Right.
happen. And another thing that I feel like I experience quite often is because, like, I've done, some interviews. I like talking with other people in the community. And as well intentioned as this statement is, after I have like interviews like this or talks like this, I get the, wow, you do know a lot about comics. You do know your stuff. And I'm like, have you ever told that to a man?
Right.
And so I'm not saying that that is gatekeeping, and I'm not saying that's keeping people out. But when you say
Hmm.
statements like that, it's like, well, you're not the normal. So
Yeah.
you end up associating things like comic books and graphic novels and these like amazing stories of, why are you here?
Hmm.
People like you are not normally here.
Yeah.
So that's, as good natured as that comment is, there's always a little bit of a sting to it.
Yeah. Yeah. It shows a bias that's there
Mm-hmm.
that they're
Yeah.
probably unaware of,
Mm-hmm.
but it's there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So now, white women, in particular, are not really a rarity in comic books, but a lot of white female superheroes have a similar body type,
Mm-hmm.
have been portrayed in a much different light than male heroes have. When was the first time you remember looking at a comic and thinking, this is actually a really strong woman character here? This is a badass female.
I would say the first time that I specifically remember that, I'm going to go back to the OG Sandman. I remember, and I wouldn't necessarily say because of Death,
Hmm.
who is one of the Endless. If you haven't read Sandman, it's a really fantastic story, and it's about the Endless, which is 7 siblings. Death is one of them, and her body type wasn't necessarily different than what I had seen, because she is very like wispy.
Hmm.
However, the way that she was drawn and the way that her character is, it wasn't that her character was based on just how she looked, but it is a part of her element. She was actually based off of a real woman, Cinnamon Hadley, who actually passed away 2 years ago to
Oh,
cancer.
wow.
So I remember seeing a character like Death, and is that weird gothy girl in high school trying to figure out who I was. I looked at Death and I was like, that's that's who I want to be. Like, her character was quirky, her character was smart, her character was kind but still didn't take any shit. And I remember that being a character that I really appreciated. So I think any character like that that I can relate to in that way, I've appreciated that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Um, so the majority of female superheroes, not all, but a lot,
Hmm.
have been created and written by men.
Hmm.
Um, how do you feel about men writing female characters?
You know, I would say this is the tough one, because what I want to see more women writing women characters. However, I don't think that men can't write them. There's two, well, I would say two or three authors that I think do this really well. One, Neil Gaiman, like hands down, I think that he writes women very, very well, and a lot of the stories that he tells about women. Another one that I really enjoy is Greg Rucka.
Yeah.
I always forget how to pronounce his name.
Me too.
Yeah. So, if I'm pronouncing it wrong, please correct me. Greg Rucka. And I think that not only does he do as what I assume is a straight white male. I assume he's straight. I don't know. Maybe that's just heteronormative, but as at least a cis white male, I think that he writes queer female characters really well. And he actually writes, he wrote one of my favorite characters, Batwoman, Kate Kane, and her story is one of those other ones that just really solidified my love for comic books. I absolutely love Batwoman. And I think that, let me think, because he did Gotham Central, which he writes about, I can't think of the detective's name off the top of my head. But he also wrote Batwoman. He also wrote The Old Guard. And I just think that he does queer characters really well. And I think that that is just being a really good writer. Another person who I think does characters very well that's outside of their maybe worldview that they grew up with is Brian Michael Bendis. Writing characters like Miles Morales and Ironheart. I think that if I were to be here to say, if you are a cis-het white dude, you can only write cis-het white dudes, right? Like that defeats the purpose. However, I think that we can, as writers, we can read stories that aren't necessarily in that same worldview that they maybe grew up with. And I think it's important to be challenged as a writer, but you have to do it, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, you have to do it with a sense of you will always be an outsider, right? So if me as a female, a white female, if I were to write a character whose story, it revolves around a Black woman. Yes, we may have similar stories because we're women and we feature the same, there's going to be things that happen to both of us, similar stories. However, I could surround myself with friends of all different types, but I will always be an outsider to Black culture, right? I'm only observing it as an outsider. Same thing goes with writers who write stories about, an American writer writing about Asian characters, right?
Right.
Oftentimes, not only are you writing as an outsider with a very shallow world view of how that actually works, I think it's often done with fetishization. So I think that, there's two different sides to that. I don't want to say, no, you're not allowed to write it. But I also think that you have to understand as a writer, you're always doing it as an outsider to that group.
That's my son.
That was adorable. So, and I think that one thing that's important to understand for writers as well is that people aren't monolithic, right? So me as a white woman, my experiences as a white woman are not monolithic. It's not going to be the same thing for all of us.
Right.
And I think the same thing is true when we talk about representation. When we only write, like if we say like, okay, I want to challenge myself as a writer and I'm a cis white hetero dude and I'm going to write a queer Black female, you have to understand that not all Black women are the same, right? Like they all experience different challenges in life. We all do, but things are going to be different for people growing up that way. So that would be one thing. If I could write a checklist for writers writing outside of their scope, it would be to just, one, know that you're always writing it from an outsider perspective. Yeah. Two, know that whatever you learn from whatever research that you do, that's not the end all be all of that particular type of person.
Right. I like that you mentioned, to my knowledge, I'll say this, to my knowledge, Brian Michael Bendis is one of those people, white men, who has created a lot of characters of color and outside of his, and
Hmm.
different genders and all that. But I think, from my understanding, he does a lot of research and he surrounds himself with artists of color and
Yeah.
co-writers of color and
Hmm.
really, really helps flesh that out. So I really love your take on that. That's
Yeah.
wonderful.
Thank you.
In comic books, what stories are we missing about women?
Um, I would say the stories that I really want to see, me personally, is one, I want to see more female villains. I want to
Mm,
see. I also want to see really trashy. I don't know if I'm allowed to curse. If you want to bleep
go
this out,
for it.
but
No,
I want
go
to
for
see.
it.
I want to see some fucked up women. I want to see women who are not necessarily damaged, but aren't the good guys, right?
Hmm.
Because um, we've yes, 100%. I think stories like Wonder Woman, where she's the hero, Batwoman, she's the hero. We're not going to see those people as the bad guys, but I think that we can't just have female heroes. We have to have women who we don't like. And I think that a lot of times we don't, there's female characters that are often written by men that we just don't like, and maybe that's not because the character doesn't have the potential, but maybe they're just, I'm Jessica Rabbit, I'm not bad, I'm just
Mm,
drawn that way. Like maybe all these um you know um so I really just want to see some very conflicted women who
hmm.
um I hate the term Mary Sue, but that's the one coming to mind, is
Hmm.
that women who are just presented to us as powerful. Like, I think it's important to see women struggle, but in a non girlfriend in the refrigerator type way.
Yeah, yeah. Um, it's probably not perfect, but the most recent series of Livewire really portrayed Livewire as a much more conflicted character on that kind of verge of being good, or what is she going
Hmm.
overboard? And you're right, that was a really great story there. Um, what stories do we just need to retire at this point? Like, it's been said, it's been done, we get it. Let's move on.
Yeah, I actually I just mentioned. In my opinion, I think that the women in refrigerators needs to be just absolutely done. For anyone who doesn't know what that term is or where it came from, it's basically the shelving or killing, torturing of a female character who is often just in the um, male protagonist's life just to further his story.
Hmm.
And the term actually comes from Green Lantern, his girlfriend. Green Lantern comes home and finds his girlfriend like chopped up in the refrigerator. And
Hmm.
there was in the 90s, there was like an early internet blog that Gail Simone helped create. And all of these times when women were put into stories just to be killed off. And I think that's another part of whenever someone looks at a character and says, "Oh, I see myself in that character. I see someone represented who looks like how I look or how I feel," only to have that character die just so the male protagonist can have a sad and have a cry
Hmm.
and have some feelings. And I think that just it needs to go away. I think that we need to write. I want to see 1,000 more female villains before I see a female just fridged.
Yeah, fridged.
Um,
And you're right that that happens a lot in indie comics because we
mhm,
have these guys who maybe grew up in the '90s reading those storylines,
mhm,
coming, growing up, and then making their own comic books, and that's the pattern they follow. Oops, sorry,
yeah,
hit my mic. More times than not, is that this weak female character, and the female character is used as a
mhm,
plot device to further the male story.
yeah.
You were going to say
And
something else.
and I think that it furthers the it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Hmm.
Because I know that the argument or the feeling like I wish that there were more women in the industry, or I wish more girls were into comics. And I know that's not a new thing that's being said, but I think that it is um, we see these stories where the only woman in the story ends up being murdered in a gruesome way. And it's like, am I supposed to like, I mean, for years I've been putting up with stories like that to get to the really good ones. So
Right.
all I would ask from creators who want to write a story like that is why?
Mm-hmm.
If you want something, if you want your female character to go through something just to further someone else's plot, or another point of contention, and I'm going to go ahead and say, like, trigger warning here. I apologize if this is, I know this is a very sensitive subject, but another topic that I think just should never be in any media ever again is just rape. A female character, male character, whoever, doesn't need to be raped just to show that the person doing that thing is a bad person, right? Like, we don't need to write that into a story to show that someone's a villain. We don't need that to happen to characters. Like, just stop it.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to happen.
Exactly. No, I'm with you there. I'm with you. And yeah, that again, that kind of calling out some indie creators here, but that happens way too often in indie comics, again, because I don't think the current climate of indie comics is basically anybody can make a comic, and that's wonderful, getting those stories out there, those artists represented. But then you also get mixed in a lot of people who haven't put, like you were talking before, that research into stories and knowing and identifying better traits of characters.
Yeah. I feel like one of the stories that I think does that well, if that can even be said, is The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Anyone who's thinking about like writing something like that about a character, I would recommend reading or at least researching that, because I think it handles that subject in a way that empowers the character, instead of just, oh, I'm going to make this shitty thing happen to this character just to prove a point. So that's what I would recommend to anyone writing a story like that.
That's great. So speaking of books then that maybe we shouldn't be putting out there, what are some comic books, mainstream or indie, that people could read right now that have a strong female lead?
I feel like there's a lot, but I also feel like there are a ton that get canceled, right? So I think that it's important. One, I'm going to preface this statement with, if you do find a story that you like that does have a strong character that you really enjoy, buy it. Vote with your dollars, because it matters, especially when it comes to the single issues. Like, if you buy anything published by a major publication, I would say one of my absolute favorites is going to be Saga. And back to the point where, we were talking about, I like seeing like messed up characters that aren't perfect and aren't cookie cutter. Alana from Saga, I think, does a really good job of that. She's a former soldier, now on the run, and I think she's conflicted about that, and conflicted about her role as now a mother, and there's a lot going on. So I would say Saga is definitely, like, even though it's on like a 2-year hiatus right now, I'm still waiting for it to come back.
It's a great time to catch up if you haven't yet.
For sure. You've got hope. I mean, you've had some time. It's only 9 volumes. But not only does it show one really strong character, I think female character, but I also think that it shows several really cool female characters, as well as male characters that aren't just toxic male, that are dealing with those things, or they are dealing with that toxic masculinity.
I love that. What are some woman creators that people should be following right now in the industry?
So first one that comes to mind is Kelly Sue DeConnick. I absolutely, like, I'll pick up anything that she comes out with. The artist Emma Rios, I'm a really big fan of. Fiona Staples, who does the artwork for Saga. I'm also a very big fan of Gail Simone. Mariko Tamaki. Goodness, there's so many good female creators out there right now. I'm trying to, like, thinking about all the books behind me, like, how much time do you have? How much time do I have? No, I'm just kidding. I won't do that, because there's a lot back here. Those are going to be like my main ones. Yeah, Gail
That's
Simone
cool.
and oh my goodness, Stephanie Hans, who does the artwork
Mm,
for Die.
hmm
Oh my goodness, I could gush about female creators.
That's awesome. And we'll be sure to try to tag some of those people afterwards once this airs too. If you want to come through and just tag away for anybody you forgot, do
Yeah,
it. Do it so people get exposure.
yeah.
Um, Jennifer, thank you so much
Thank you
for
so
being
much.
here today. This has been great, a great
Yeah,
conversation. I've enjoyed all these conversations on representation in comics, and I've learned something new with each one. But tell people out there how people can find you, how they can support you. I think
yeah.
you have a Patreon,
I do.
so tell people about it.
Yeah. So I would say the easiest like free ways to find me. I'm on Instagram as Comic Books Will Break Your Heart, as we discussed earlier. On YouTube, I'm on Comics Will Break Your Heart. I do have a Patreon, and there's 3 levels with Patreon that I have right now: a $2, $5, and $10 level. And you get different things depending on which one you do. So I think I did the math, and for like 6 cents a day, you can support a girl in Oregon doing comic reviews, kind of some wacky, zany stuff. Like sometimes it may be a more professional, like advanced review. Like I got this advanced review for a comic book, or sometimes it's just I start to do a video and it just flops and you get the bloopers.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So, guys out there, if you're watching this, go find Jennifer. Comics Will Break Your Heart on most platforms, but Comic Books Will Break Your Heart on Instagram. If you're interested, go to her Patreon. Support for as little as $2 a month. That's nothing. That's nothing. And if you have a few extra dollars, go up to that $10 level. Jennifer, thank you again so much for being here. When we post this, I hope you'll come back if there's any question, guys. Though we are not live right now, post questions, ask those questions, and I at least will come back through. And if I can, I'll tag Jennifer in it so that she can answer any questions that are out there also. So again, thank you, Jennifer, for being here today. We'll see you guys next time.